should be good.
Alrighty. So I was just chatting with Jeff prior to the session, and since you started ratifying, now become a Microsoft guru, so I can talk about all of this stuff, and he's going to go, yes. So this session's hopefully it doesn't come across too much of a sales pitch, but I guess I do want to convey what we found works really well out of the use of Visual Studio Team System, or Team Services as they now refer to it. So this is one of those products that Microsoft keeps on wrangling and changing from one product name to another. So it used to be TFS, which was the on-premise version, and then it became Visual Studio Online, then it was originally Visual Studio Team Systems, and then Services. Anyway, they've settled on VSTS. If you hear me talk about TFS, I mean the same thing. What continues to amaze me about what they're doing with this stuff in the cloud is that every time I go in there's something new that they've added. And unfortunately, there's a case of where they moved my cheese to, right? It's sort of like, so you go hunting for something, you know exactly where it is, and they've moved it. But on the flip side, there's always new stuff that you can sort of jump in and start to make use of. And so the build and release process is one of those things that for a long time, we didn't really have a dedicated build and release process. And as we started to migrate out of the Windows world into being a much more cross-platform shop, we found that obviously the tooling that was coming to the platform was basically made it really easy for us to do the build and deploy process, which of course gets rid of developer mistakes. And we were literally just talking beforehand about the fact that you could run scripts locally to basically push things up to the Apple Store or Google Play. And my attitude is that I don't want that. Okay, so here's a bit of a story. It's a bit anecdotal. So we've got 5 guys working for us now, and we're based in North Sydney in a building that basically it's going to cost us an arm and a leg to get cable connection. So the upshot is that we're stuck on ADSL for the foreseeable future until we grow to a size where we need bigger premises and we can afford to get cable in. And as we started to get to a more structured process in terms of doing nightly builds and deploying through Hockey app every single day for every app that we're working on, all of a sudden it's 5 guys working on at least 5 apps a day, right? So that means 5 new builds, probably across a couple of platforms, right? Average build size, let's say 50 megs. That's a lot of uploading all at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock or whenever they decide to go home, right? And the upshot is that basically they all came to upload and then they'd have to literally go home and let it upload. And so probably 50% of the builds didn't get uploaded properly, and so I'd get home or whatever and I'd be checking the builds later on and I wouldn't be able to, right? So, and there was this continual frustration around that time because everyone wanted to upload the build and go home. And so they basically there was almost mutiny on the ship. So one of the guys said, look, it would make sense if we automated this process. And I went, yep, it would. And they go, okay, well, let's check out what's available in the cloud. So what I'm going to go through today is basically the structure of how we go about using what's in Visual Studio Team Services to actually go from both the structure of the workflow of the work items that we're working on, all the way through to checking in source code, all the way through to build and then release. Now, another story. So I thought, yep, okay, we've done this a few times before. We know what we're doing. So I thought, okay, Monday morning I'll get the guys together and we'll build a very simple app, right? So meeting room, like a meeting note-taking app. Okay, it's 2 pages, right? So the first page is a list of meetings we've been to. You click an add button, you go to another page, you fill in the notes and off you go. I thought, okay, the app's a no-brainer. It's really simple. We'll have it using mobile services. Again, it's a really no-brainer. You basically create the services in the cloud and you can start consuming them. Okay, so all up the app probably takes about half a day to build. I was thinking, okay, well, if we take half a day to build, let's say another half a day to do the release and deploy process. 2 days later, we're still not at a point where we're releasing all platforms, but we're a long way the way there, and I'll walk you through where some of the pain points associated with that are. And nearly all of them are getting that build process working correctly. Because if you're doing an iOS build and an Android build and a Windows build, there are quirks about every single build agent that you work with that make it difficult, or you have to do some little quirk to get it to work, even though it all builds and runs in Visual Studio. And then there's the service platform as well, and I'll show you how we do service deployment. And again, this is zero touch from a developer. So at the end of the day, one touch, because they go to the website and hit build, right? But they don't actually touch any of the code. They don't need to increment version numbers or anything like that. That's all handled by the build and deploy process. And that's all the way through to, it publishes stuff to Azure, so the services go to Azure. It handles publishing to Hockey App. In fact, we do that with every single build that we do as part of our continuous build. And then it handles the release process, so it actually uses, well, I think Jeff, you were saying that actually behind the scenes it uses Fastlane to basically push the builds up to iOS, Google Play and the Windows Store as well. So I'll talk you through some of those. What we're going to do is start with their, I guess, their iteration planning tool, which is basically, I don't know how clearly that's coming through, but essentially it allows you to basically break things down into sprints, and then manage things as either backlogs or user stories, depending on what your terminology is. And you can see here that the documentation got left to last, as you can imagine. It always does. And I've got one task that was left, well, it's actually assigned to me. It was actually picked up by me at the very end of today when I try to get involved, as all good managers do, and try to right the wrong. I was very unsuccessful, as all managers are. Best leave it to the people who are doing it day to day. Okay, what I am going to do is I've got one unfinished task in here that is also assigned to me, and what we're going to do is flip over to Visual Studio, and I'll show you how this stuff surfaces in Visual Studio, so that as a developer I don't need to go to this portal every day. Okay, I can literally go into Visual Studio, look at the list of tasks that are assigned to me, and start working on them. And in fact, one of my guys, we keep on saying, okay, well, why did this get moved into close when it's not, or what about these other tasks that you haven't even touched? And he basically goes, okay, well, if it doesn't appear in Visual Studio, it's not assigned to me. And we go, that's a fair call, right? Because he basically uses the interface within Visual Studio to drive what he's doing and the tasks there. Okay, so flip across to Visual Studio. This is a Xamarin Forms project, okay? So, and it's a very, very basic one. So normally with this portable library, we'd probably break out into two just to get the separation between the views that are defined in the Xamarin Form library and the corresponding view models, because I'm not a big fan of having them in the same project because you end up with too much of an interdependency between them. Behind the scenes, this is also using MVVM Cross. We're basically just using that to make sure that we've got a good navigation flow between the pages. And again, it gives that level of abstraction so that you're doing view model to view model navigation as versus even Xamarin Forms, which really does view to view navigation. So those basically are the first set of projects. So obviously the Droid, iOS, and we've got a UWP head on this. And then we've basically got a services project. And this is, for those who haven't used mobile services, you can think of it as basically a little bit more of a sophisticated wrapper around Entity Framework and SQL Server in the back end, right? So it basically exposes out a set of services for each of your tables that you can lock down using authentication. In this case, obviously we haven't, but it basically gives you out of the box CRUD methods for them. Yeah. So, and it makes it really easy to consume them from the client side because they've got a really good client side wrapper. And so if I actually break this out and look at in here, you'll see we've got a meeting service that basically creates an instance of the mobile service client, and then the get operation is kind of very similar to what you'd expect from Entity Framework. So you basically get a reference to the table and you start pulling stuff from it. Now, my original idea of this was I was actually going to use Entity Framework Core, which is basically Microsoft's skimmed down version of Entity Framework so that it can work cross-platform. Bad news is that I couldn't get it to work on Android or iOS. Worked beautifully for UWP, and obviously they've really tested that one. In fact, all the docs talk about how to do UWP and ASP.NET Core. Of course, they've kind of forgotten the fact that the reason that they did it was to get it to work on iOS and Android. So there's no samples, there's no response back to the forums that say this is currently broken. But it is definitely getting there, and I mean it's a really, really nice wrapper around using SQLite on the client side. So it's really, really elegant. And how many people have actually used Entity Framework on the server side? Okay, so you're used to how you do add migration to basically, update the SQL Server based on your model changes. Well, the client side, you can do that in the client side, so it's really awesome. So, you basically change your model, you run add migration, it generates all of the SQL script for you, and so it's really quite clever from that regard.
That's the code first.
Yeah, it's the code first, yeah. And so the mobile services that we're actually connecting to here, again, work the same way. So behind the scenes, they're using Entity Framework. So if you want to add classes or tables, you create the corresponding models, code first, migrates the database as you publish. Okay, so it's really quite a clever approach. Now, what we used to do with the services is we used to come in here and actually go publish, okay? And this process is very nice in Visual Studio for a developer that wants to completely break stuff, okay? So you walk through this process and, it basically gets you to sign in to Azure, and assuming that you've got access to all of the various bits in Azure, it will walk you through the process of saying, hey, which slot do you want to publish this thing to? And then you go ahead and you click publish, and it all looks great, and it works for you. The other developer in your team then downloads everything from source control, tries to go through the publish process, and it says, hey, what's your password? Of which case you need to go back through that authentication process. You basically need to set up another connection into Azure. So you end up with this massive long list of profiles. Okay, I've got a couple in there. This is not the way to do it, okay? This might be the way that you do it the very first time to get something into Azure. But once you've got this set up, then you need to set up a build process. Okay, so right now I could basically restrict access to all of the components in Azure. The guys can still go and do a build, okay, and it's going to push it out into our test slot. I'll talk about slots in a minute, but the idea is that by triggering the build, they can actually publish that way, okay, and it means that they're not going to break things. It means that they're going to be running the latest code. Another way that you can do this is, again, build process is continuous delivery. So if you want to set up on check-in, you can. So you can get the test cases to run. You can basically do auto deploy to that slot. And again, why you have slots will come important in a minute. Okay. The other thing that you can do for certain projects is go via the Visual Studio to actually distribute via Hockey app. Okay, so there's quite a nice little UI editor for basically doing exactly the same thing as we just talked about in services, but basically publishing out through Hockey app through the designer within Visual Studio. Again, not something you really want to be doing because this is going to generate a 50 to 100 meg upload, particularly for UWP, if you're going to do all of the packages. So not something I would particularly recommend doing on a frequent basis. So we've got the basic structure here. Let's just go in and actually implement a change. And so what I want to do is come into the Team Explorer. Okay, so this is my Visual Studio interface to what's happening in Visual Studio Team Services. And I can go to my work. And you can see here that I've got available work items. I've got to pre-fill this because it'll take a few seconds to pull it down each time. And what I'm going to do is go and drag one of these. So I'm going to change the background color, and I will drag it up into in progress. Okay. And essentially what that'll do is it actually goes out to the portal and basically updates the status to now in progress. So assuming all the demo gods are with me, if I then refresh this page, we'd hope that this moves into the active column. Okay. So the idea there is that me as the manager, I can go via the portal and I can see automatically what's happening. What I don't like about the portal is it doesn't automatically refresh. For anyone who's used Trello before, if you've got two people editing the same thing, things dynamically move. I really, really like that. I wish they'd do it on here because I'd love to see my tasks actually migrate. It'd be very cool. But no, you have to forcibly refresh it. So back into Visual Studio. Okay, so we've got our work. Let's actually go and do some work. So I'm going to bring up the design of our page. And I'm going to switch the text color and the background color. So let's just change that to black. And I'll change my text color to white. And let me just set my UWP project as the startup. And I'll just run that up. Now, apologies, this is an atrociously designed page, probably one of the worst you've ever seen. You don't reckon?
There'll be something.
Wait until it comes up.
I used to work at BB6. It's fine.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fair point taken. Yeah. All right. This is going to take a minute or so to come up. What I'm going to do while that's coming up, and it'll interrupt me in a minute when it does finally come up. So this is basically the work area for what you'll currently work on. Across the top, you'll actually see that there's a number of other tabs. Now, these are all related to the project that I've currently got open. If I want to switch between projects, obviously there's a big long list of the projects we've got currently going, so I can dynamically switch between those. Typically I end up with projects going across the tabs, and then I just switch through the sections here. Right now I've actually got the build and release section open for, let's actually get the ones for this project. No, I don't have it open, so let's just go and open that. So builds. And so typically for our projects, we end up with a number of different, what they refer to as build definitions. And so you can think of these as basically the templates for each build that you want to invoke. And so typically we'll have one for build for each platform. Unfortunately, the problem with supporting multiple different platforms is that there's no single one build host agent that will actually do it for all. So for iOS, you're typically going to have some Mac build agent, and for us, we use Mac in Cloud. They actually have a monthly service that's actually completely headless in the sense that you don't sign into it, and it's just set up as a build server. So we literally, and it integrates very well with Visual Studio Team services, so that we'll actually schedule a build to actually be done on that on Mac in Cloud. Those guys are really responsive. If you want to go down the path of doing automated builds in the cloud, I'd highly recommend using them. We use them actually for iOS and Android because we can email them at any hour and they'll actually get back to us and say, yep, that patch that's just been released, we'll install it for you on your machine right now. Whereas you try and do that with Microsoft, who also have Build Agent, they go, no, you're stuck with the template until we update it in 3 months' time. Right, so which is not cool for iOS and Android, particularly when Xamarin does, stable patches quite frequently that you really, really do want. So it pays to have somebody who's actually going to update your build agent. So Mac and Cloud, it's a dedicated agent, so it's essentially a virtual machine that's sitting there waiting for you to trigger off builds. So we use them for iOS and Android. Unfortunately, you can't use a Mac to do UWP builds, and it's not also very good for doing service builds unless you're doing something like ASP.NET Core, in which case you can do the build on those machines because it's all cross-platform now. Okay, so looks like we don't have any meetings in here, so let me go. I did warn you that the interface was really bad. This is the Xamarin group meeting. Let's go and save that. Okay. So we have our meeting there. Now actually this has actually gone all the way through back to that services that I was talking about. So it's not held locally. If I close the app and restart it, it'll actually load it there. Right, so my change is looking pretty terrible, but I'm going to check it in anyhow because I'm a rebel. So we'll go down over to here, and I'll go to my Team Explorer because I'm pretty good at least checking what I'm about to check in. So pending changes, I'm not one of those ones that just go, hey, just check everything in. I'll actually go and review my changes, so I can go view changes to the workspace, and I can go, yeah, oh look, I got rid of some comments, I've changed some text, and so the diff editor here is relatively good. I mean, it's a good experience to make changes to. Okay, I'm pretty happy with those changes. I'm going to go and check them in. You'll notice that the work item that I pushed to in progress has now appeared here. If I hadn't done that, I can actually search for it by work item ID, which is really an obtuse way of looking for things, particularly when you look over on the workboard and there is no reference to any IDs, right? So over here, I'd actually have to click into this and go in the top left corner here, it does actually get a work item ID. One of the first customizations we do is we come into here, and for tasks, bugs, and user stories, we show the ID, right? So when you're looking at anyone, you know immediately what the work item ID is. So if you happen to have the reverse workflow where you're working off the web portal, you can quite easily copy that into here and actually add it, the ID and load the items in that way. The other thing you'll notice is that we've got a drop down here that says associate or resolve. Okay, so you don't need to close off a ticket every time you check in. Sometimes you just got to check in some stuff and see whether it works before you actually want to mark the task as resolved. Behind the scenes, the term resolved basically will move it into that closed field. So just be aware of that, whereas associate will leave it with the current status. I'm going to resolve this because I reckon that change is really, really bad, but it's exactly what I wanted. And I'm going to apply a check-in comment. For those who are interested, you can go and customize the check-in process, so you can actually put constraints on there. So say, okay, it's got to have a comment, and you can actually build your own plugins that will actually enforce certain things like code audit and things like that as well. Okay, color change to background. and I'll kick that off. Now I've actually disabled the build on commit, but what we'll see is that it's really easy to enable that. So what we'll do though is actually go into our build system, and I'm going to, let me pick the right one, come over here, and we're going to do 2 deploys. We're going to basically show the web services, so we're going to push a new build of the web service, and we'll do a new UWP build. So these are all of our build definitions. You can see when they were last built, and you can actually drill through them, and you'll actually be able to get through to the full log output, and all of the artifacts are basically housed there as well. You've got control over what the retention policy is, so because obviously you pay for a certain amount of storage as part of this as well. So our retention policy on most of this stuff is fairly low because we don't need a big archive of the recurring builds. So let me go and actually trigger a UWP build, so I can click on that and go queue new build. And I can say that I'm going to apply an update to the background color. Okay, and we'll kick that one off. So you'll see there that editor that actually came up basically had a series of build variables that come up, so you can actually tailor some of those. And you'll see in a minute when we actually, I think when we do the web service one, that I can control the slot that it goes to. More about slots in a minute. So you can see here that it's basically waiting for a build agent. It looks like one of the, somebody's already running a build, so we might come back to that one. Oh look, there it's going. And this will flip over to the actual console. So it's really good. I mean, I know you guys probably can't read that from there, but basically I can see exactly what's happening. It's got really good color coding, so as soon as something goes wrong, it basically will highlight it along the process as well. So we'll leave that one running. What I want to do is just quickly talk you through the service side of things. Now this is using the new Azure Portal Manager. And so what we've done is there are a couple of things for this project that we've got in Azure. So we've got a set of services that are there, and those are really a wrapper around the data layer that we've got. And in this case, the project's relatively simple. So we've only got a SQL Server database. We've got the services there. And the way that Azure packages those is that they actually give you a logical SQL server, right? So within that server, you can then have a number of databases. You don't actually pay for that server, so it's really just a logical notion of a grouping of databases. So you can see that here. So this first item here is basically they refer to it as SQL Server, and it goes and allows you to configure a few things like the version of SQL Server. Bear in mind, you're not literally, they don't have a box somewhere that you're running on that you're going and messing with the parameters on. When you mess with those parameters, what they do is they transfer your database across to a server that actually does have the right parameters for you. Because behind the scenes, each one of these databases is set up in cluster mode. So the idea there is you've got high redundancy. So if one of those nodes goes, it'll automatically replicate and it stays available. Now, that doesn't mean that it's got a high performance, it means that it's highly available, right? It basically means if you slam that database, you'll start to get some non-responsiveness. It doesn't mean the database is down, it just basically means it stopped responding to you, okay? So just be aware of that about SQL Server in the cloud. If you want, high availability and high performance, move away from using SQL Server, like most of the planet is. Okay, SQL Server is great as a relational database, good for a long-term storage of entities. If you're doing serious stuff in the cloud, you've got to move to one of the non-relational formats. So in the case of Azure, it's document data, DB, table storage, blob storage, any of those highly redundant storage mechanisms. This is a simple example of a project. So we've got below that, we've got 2 SQL databases because we actually replicate everything we're doing in production in test. Okay, so we have a production database and we've got a test database. What you'll see down here is that we've then got this bottom one here is a representative of our app service. And the first thing you're going to ask me is, hey, where's your test instance? They've done a really nice mechanism for grouping together services so that you don't have to have this plethora of different services, even though that basically replicate each other. So in the case here, if I drill into that, what you'll see is that they've got this notion of deployment slots, okay? So for us, when we're deploying stuff, we don't ever deploy straight into the production slot, so this app service. What we do is we deploy to our test slot, and depending on what app service plan you've got with Azure, you can have one or more test slots, okay? So the other day we were trialing something out for a single sign-on for a project. And so we had to basically set it up to point to a completely different Azure AD environment. So all we did was create a brand new slot. So we went add slot, okay, and it comes and says, okay, well, what do you want to call this? So I can go dev, and I can basically say, hey, go and clone the all settings from this particular slot. So I can clone them from production or from test. Which leads on to an interesting point about these slots, okay? The really interesting thing about these slots is they maintain their own web.config essentially, okay? Now it's not actually a web.config file, it's basically the configuration information that's stored in the Azure portal. So if I come down here and look at app settings, you'll see that I've got a range of settings in here, and some of them are marked as slot settings. Okay? In fact, in this case, none of them are. What it means by slot settings are those settings basically remain with the slots. When you're actually going to go to publish something from test into prod, rather than having to do a rebuild, so a release build, and then publish that release build out to production, what we do is we publish the release build out into test, and then we slot swap. Okay, so it does two things. Firstly, it means that your downtime is basically negligible, right? Because it immediately switches what's in test into prod. It also gives you instantaneous backup, right? Because it means that if things go completely pear-shaped, you slot swap back, and you're back to where you came from. Okay. To facilitate that, these app settings basically remain with the slot. So if I check one of these settings as a slot setting, it will remain with that slot. If it's not checked, it'll actually travel with your deployment, right? So if you switch the slots and it's not a slot setting, it'll actually switch with the migrated code. All right, let's flip back and see where our production's got to. Okay, so, failed to upload package, that's not a good sign. Yeah, I'm guessing, and I'll try this by going over to Hockey App and actually refreshing over here. I'm pretty certain that they haven't got the UWP build to actually deploy out to Hockey App yet. No. Okay. I did warn you that part is a little broken, right? And they were still working. It was they swore that they were going to get it to work by the time I was standing in front of you guys. Right. So let me show you one that does actually work. And what we'll do is we'll come back to our builds, and let me just grab all definitions. I'll push out two new builds. We'll do a web service build, so I'll queue that one. And you'll notice here that I've actually got the name of the slot. So let's just flip back over here, and let's discard those. And this is going to be running the demo gauntlet. Let's go add slot, and I will do dev. I'm going to copy settings from test, and I'll go OK. Okay, in a minute or so it'll come back. Okay, that's done. So we're going to change this slot here to dev, and we'll go ahead and publish that. And if the demo goes with me, that should appear shortishly. But let's actually go back to our builds and actually kick off another build. We'll kick off the Android build and all definitions. We'll queue up that. And over here, I've got my Hockey app for Android. Okay, so for each of the deployment targets that we want to do, so Android, iOS, and UWP, we'll have a Hockey app set up. And you can see here that we've successfully managed to deploy a number of the Android builds. And so if I go through to one of these, I can click on the download link here, and it will download the package. If you do it on the actual Android device, it'll actually allow you to go ahead and actually install that device. So we're up to code 2650, so hopefully that will increase once our build is done as well. Let's go back to our builds. I'll click OK on that. And let's just go back to our queued build. So you should see that this one sits queued, at least for a little bit. In this particular scenario, we're actually using the Microsoft hosted build agent. As I mentioned before, we do use Mac and Cloud for all of our production builds for iOS and Android. With that in mind, what I wanted to do is actually just show you, and while these builds are in progress, I want to show you what we've got set up for one of our clients, which is Boost. And you can see here a very similar structure in terms of the way that our builds are set up. So we're doing Android, iOS, that's also Mac and Cloud, even though it doesn't say so. We've got a Windows Phone build, and that's traditional Windows Phone as opposed to UWP. And then we've got services and product editor, which is basically their web portal. And again, these are always set up exactly the same way as we just saw. The only big difference is that we're actually pushing out an iOS build, which you didn't see before. So let me go in and actually show you one of these. And I'll just show you the interface that they provide for actually going and editing these. It's quite nice. They've done quite a good job of actually breaking it down, and this is actually pretty similar to things like TeamCity and stuff like that in terms of the various steps. To go and add build step, there's a couple of things. So there's a whole big long list of in their catalog, but you can actually go and build your own. Okay, so if what you want isn't there, you can go and build your own. Essentially, you end up running on a Windows box if you're doing a Windows build. If you're using Mac and Cloud, obviously, or a Mac box, but you can literally run anything you want. So even if you don't go and create your own task to go into this catalog, what you can do is there's some fairly generic things, like you can run batch scripts and you can run command runs and curl and things like that. So you can actually get pretty low level in terms of that. And 9 times out of 10, you definitely need to do that. So you'll see even here, we've probably got a couple of individual things like, so NuGet is the bane of our existence with builds. It always ends up being the first thing that we struggle to get right. And typically we'll end up having a separate task there to do the proper NuGet restore that we want. So that's just running a shell script. And you can see that we've got various steps in here for basically incrementing version number. You can see that we're doing the signing of the APK. These two steps here are basically aggregating the output of that build process into an artifacts folder so that they can actually get saved to against the build. And then the final step is basically the deployment hockey app. So, and for all of those, you can essentially click on them, and they've got a number of predefined connection strings and things like that are set up. And they've done a really good job of integrating this with your source control. So it doesn't matter whether you're using Git or whether you're using the built-in source control for Visual Studio Team Services. They basically provide an editor for you to basically navigate that structure and work out where the solution files or the project files are that you basically want to invoke. So it's been really well architected. Across the top, we've got things like variables. So you can see when I went through and actually specified what the slot was that we're going to deploy to, that was one of these build variables. And this option on the right-hand side basically allows the person who's triggering the build to go and override the default values. And so typically we'll do that for the web deploys to allow the slot to be overridden. The next thing, once you've got your build sorted out, Microsoft or the Visual Studio Team Services make a distinction between build and release. And it's not to say that you can't do release activities inside your build process, but what they try and do is get you to think about separating the two. And so what we have for Boost, again, is actually some release definitions. And so what you can see over here is that basically we have, when we're doing a release, we're released in this case, 2 environments. And this is actually because we're stuck waiting for Microsoft to give us access to the Windows Store for our account, because it's still in the submissions API for Windows Store is still in pre-release. But essentially what you can see here is that essentially we've got 2 environments that we're deploying. So when we actually trigger this release, we can nominate which environment to release to. And so we can say, okay, well, we just want to do an iOS release, or we just want to do an Android, or we want to do both concurrently. And essentially what this does is it basically goes through and will actually prepare the submission to basically send it off to the App Store. And there's a bunch of options that you can go through and specify there. What's really interesting is the integration with that build process that we were just talking about. And so that's what this artifacts column is talking about. So each one of these is basically set up to pull artifacts from one or more builds. Okay, so in this case, it's actually set to pull artifacts from the Android build and the iOS build. And again, at release, when you actually trigger this release, you get to go back and actually nominate which build you actually want to pull it from. Because your developers could be sitting there doing build after build after build after build, but the people who are controlling the release management basically said, okay, well actually no, we want to release based on the one that we tagged, version 1.5. Right? So you can actually go in there and actually nominate that it's going to pull the resources specifically from that build. The only other issue that we kind of found is that for iOS, we actually need to do, like for Android, it's really simple. The build that we push out through Hockey app is actually the same build that we submit to the Google Play Store. For iOS, we actually do another build for the App Store submission. So we actually have multiple builds there, which you would have seen as part of our environment, I think. actually it's not in here, but basically we actually do 2 builds normally. So one's essentially a private build that we can distribute, and the other one is one for the store. Okay, let's go back to here and let's see if our Android build has come through yet. Widget. Might have done that. That sounds like it could have been the right release. It's actually okay. So the Android build is definitely up there. And let's go and actually take a look at our service deployment as well. So they keep changing this interface, and I never work out where I'm supposed to go. Let's just go back to our builds. In the web service build. I just want to check that this actually did build and deploy properly. Okay, so that seems to have succeeded. If I go back to our UI for this slot, let's see if this is actually going to come up okay. Okay, so it's given me a dedicated URL. So that's the other really nice thing about these slots is they all get a dedicated URL. So it's essentially as if they were in production. Okay, so this is basically the landing page for mobile services. And in theory, what we should then be able to do is come back to, say, my UWP app. If I go to my constants folder in here, I'm actually going to change to just doing a debug build. And when Visual Studio stops thinking, we're going to change this to test, from test to dev. And do a build locally. This is a real test. It's actually we'll see whether it's actually going to go. So basically, when you first hit the mobile services landing page, that's when it actually does all of the migration scripts. So in theory, it's up and running. This is via the dev slot. Okay. So now the sneaky thing there is, if you recall, I actually copied the settings for that slot from test. So what we're actually seeing here is the data that's in the test database. Okay. So what we can now do is going back to our Azure portal to promote that dev slot to production. I don't click add, I go swap. And so any code that I had in that dev slot, I can actually push into production by doing that. And it's going to go, it actually does an analysis of the app settings that you've got, and it's pretty good in terms of the preview changes to basically indicate what you're going to override or what varies. And so, for example, if you've got an app setting that you've defined in test that you haven't moved into production or haven't created in production, it'll warn you about that. And similarly, if you've got different values for a setting that is not a slot setting, it'll warn you about that as well, because in theory, you should be moving towards slot settings and have them not migrate with your code, because the idea is that the code running in test should be the same code as running in prod and the same variables. Okay, so I can go ahead and do that, and that's actually going to swap at a certain point of time, so it's basically just a hot swap between those two instances. Now what the follow-on from this is actually what we do is every time when we're doing formal releases out into production, we actually create a new slot, and we call it like backup and then the date. And so we'll actually publish into that slot, we'll switch into production, so we know that we've got in that slot, that backup slot, we've got a copy of what we swapped out of production on that date. And we keep those for a week or 2 weeks to make sure that things in production sort of settle down and make sure they're all good. We also take a full backup of the site as well. So there's a facility within the Azure portal to basically take a backup into blob storage of that site. So again, if we wanted to restore that, we can restore directly out of that. So it's kind of like a twofold approach. You can see that we're pretty paranoid about the services, right? To make sure that they don't go down. So that in a nutshell is it for me for this evening. I hope I've given you a little bit of an overview of, I guess, some of the tools that are available and the level of integration in terms of Visual Studio as well. So we find it pretty powerful. It's one of those things that we're always finding new ways and improving the workflow of it. So it's just a sort of an iterative thing in terms of how we get things up and running. So, any questions?
How long does it took to finally get to this point where actually working?
So
2 days.
Yeah, so I was actually surprised at how long it did take us up, because we've actually done this a number of times now. Like all of our projects now have this. So the other day I had to do one. It was a Windows Phone, a website and a set of services, and it would have taken me a couple of hours to get it up and running. All right. iOS and Android tend to be a bit of a pain because depending on what options you've got set and which version of the Xamarin tools will determine whether you can run things on the Windows portal or whether you have to use something like Mac and Cloud. And we've had a bunch of problems, as no doubt everyone does every time Apple does a new release of, say, Xcode, and then Xamarin does a new release of their tools, and all of a sudden your build agent is about 3 weeks behind and completely broken. So that's the only downside of doing cross-platform development, but that's a pain. And the upshot is that the amount of time that we put into fixing those is definitely significantly less than what we would otherwise spend doing manual builds, and the amount of fragmentation and developer mistakes that you get out of doing a local build. You know, somebody forgets to check something in, or somebody doesn't. More importantly, they forget to do a get latest before they do a local build, and then they check in. They publish up something that's now half a day old, or however long it's taken them to do a check-in. Whereas when we do a build in the cloud, we know that at that particular point in time, that's all the code that's checked in. So, yeah, definitely worth doing. I was a bit resistant because it does mean one of my guys had to be on the bench for a while we sorted it out. But hands down, definitely one of the best decisions we've done. So.
In terms of actually business value, can you kind of quantify what it's done in terms of your ability to create revenue and
So put it this way, we do nightly releases to our customer.
Yeah.
Enough said. I mean, literally they can be seeing, like, I'm not saying that in every project you necessarily want to do this, depends on who your customer is and how active they're providing feedback, but our level of engagement on any project where we're pushing out new builds goes from, oh, can you make this change? And yeah, 3 weeks later we're pushing out a build to them, to, yep, make the change, push the build, they've got a build. Literally, if it's a half-hour change, they get it within the hour. It's incredible in terms of the amount of feedback. In terms of dollar value, well, the easiest thing is it probably was costing the devs an hour every day to build, make sure it works, submit it to Hockey app, make sure they download, test it, and that type of stuff. Now, they hit the build button, they go to the toilet, have a drink, come back, and it's done. They pull it down on the device and it's running, And then they do another one before they leave because they realise that they forgot to do something before, that they were supposed to, right? And that's actually the biggest thing we found out of it, is because they can do a build release, they pull it down to their phone, they verify what they've actually done. The number of times they've actually caught their own mistakes just because it's closed that developer loop. And that's, I guess, the other thing is that we're all used to running debug builds when we're running locally and testing and building stuff. It's only when you get the release build down on your phone that you go, that's not loaded, or that's really slow, or why is that happening, or why is it crashing on this screen? And you go, okay, well, yeah, we've got something slightly different in release mode. And so having that build process forces it down the same path every single time. It means that you're not tracing things because somebody's built things on one machine and not on another. So, for example, when Xcode 8 came out, the designer in Xamarin Studio was broken for a while until they pushed out an update. So we had guys making changes on one of our machines that was still on Xcode 7, checking stuff in, and then they would half do a build on Xcode 8, and we're getting different, like, it depended on whether they were doing a build on Xcode 8 or on Xcode 7, and depending on whether it was on iOS 10 or iOS 9, we'd see completely different things happening, and we're just going, this is crazy. You push it through a dedicated build machine, you know that you're going to get the same results every single time. So that was the big value add for us, I think. Yeah.
So are you also got moves afoot to, for example, move into more automated testing?
So definitely from the UI perspective, we're not doing automated testing at this point. We do integrate our test suite with the build and release process, so particularly for the back-end services on our core libraries. I guess one of the other things we've done is that there are a bunch of sort of helper libraries that we also manage, so and we essentially have one build process for those, and you can see, let me see, I'm going to edit this. And so this generates probably, I think, 8 or 10 different NuGet packages out of it. And so that's all, basically this is the simplified build process, this is it. And then our release definitions is this. Okay, so one build process that generates all of our DLLs, and then we basically have different releases for each NuGet package that we want to release from those. So, anything else?
Completely agree with everything you say. When you can do a release based on a pull request, it becomes seamless. You don't even think about it. It's madness not to do it.
Yeah.
Open a tab, check out fastlane.tools, and check out their marketing pitch. Fastlane.tools. There you go, right down the bottom, below the fold. Literally, like, it is absolutely nuts. So VSTS, but under the hood, is using Fastlane. Yeah, their pitch is like develop hours saved. Quite literally, I could do a release this morning, 2 or 3 releases by doing /deploy, and that took 15 minutes. And if I was doing that manually, by putting click, that would be
Yeah.
like, it's madness not.
Yeah, so that was the other change that we did as well, because originally we started using Hockey App, and we were using Hockey App to not only distribute to our dev team, we were also using it to distribute to our customers. Hockey App's an okay tool. It doesn't really work well with end customers that go through a UAT phase where they don't know exactly who they want testing, and they change things, and they add people, remove people. And damn you, Apple, they made it really difficult, because you basically have to add every single one of those devices to the provisioning profile and rebuild everything and send it out again. So yeah, the build process or the release process to release to the store as part of the test flight and the beta mechanism, phenomenal. We literally click the button, it's ready to go, it basically pushes out, and they then go and test it. So it goes out to their test group. We don't even need to go to the store and actually verify things. It just goes, we know, and we know that we've done it repetitively, we know that it's there and it works.
So how do you then handle the promotion from test flight to actual store?
So the amazing thing about there, we don't, our customers do. They will literally go and modify the metadata, they'll promote the build, and go from there. So yeah, we try to be hands off on that. Well, where we can. I mean, there's some customers that don't know what they're doing, right? So for those, we definitely handle it for them. But we have others that are used to managing that process, so they'll go ahead and, so long as it's in test flight, so long as it's in the beta process, they'll go and upgrade it. All right, thanks guys.